When the United States ships $346 million worth of bombs, missiles, and war tech to Nigeria, the headlines read, "Security Deal." But under the surface, something else is happening. They say it's for peace, but ask any historian what comes after American weapons, and you won't hear peace. You'll hear influence. You'll hear conditions. You'll hear control. Just ask Iraq. Ask Libya. Ask Vietnam. And now, Nigeria, the most populous country in Africa, becomes the next stop in a very old playbook. So we must ask, is this about defeating Boko Haram or securing Nigeria's obedience? Is this about safety or strategy? If this question stirs something inside you, pause with us. Listen closer. Watch deeper. And if Africa's true sovereignty matters to you, like, comment, and subscribe. Because this is not just a story. This is a warning. On August 13, 2025, the U.S. Defense Security Cooperation Agency quietly submitted a proposal to Congress, a $346 million arms deal for Nigeria, precision-guided bombs, Hellfire missiles, war-fighting systems, all bundled under the language of counter-terrorism support. The narrative was clean, the intention noble. The reality? Far murkier. This is not Nigeria's first gift. In 2022, the U.S. had already approved nearly $1 billion sale, including Super Tucano aircraft and weapons packages. What changed in 2025 wasn't just the numbers, it was the timing. Because right as Nigeria's old ghosts, Boko Haram, ISWAP, began to stir again, the Pentagon sent guns, not questions. The battle Nigeria is fighting today didn't begin in 2025. It never ended. Boko Haram's insurgency, launched in 2009, was never just a local affair. It was an ideological export, a virus born of inequality, injustice, and geopolitical neglect. What started as a fringe movement in Borno State spiraled into a regional nightmare, spilling into Chad, Cameroon, and Niger. By 2022, an estimated 35,000 lives were lost. Over 2 million Nigerians were displaced. The world took notice. Briefly. The United States stepped in, branding Boko Haram as a terrorist group. Drones were deployed, intel units embedded, and Nigeria, backed by Western firepower, struck back. Hard. But firepower doesn't fix famine. What many missed in the headlines was this: the soil Boko Haram grew from had never changed. The hunger, the corruption, the lack of education, the religious alienation all remained. So when American-made aircraft took out a handful of commanders, the world clapped. But new leaders emerged, new cells regrouped. And by 2025, the ghosts were back. In May and July of this year, Nigeria made headlines again. 2 high-ranking terror leaders linked to the Ansaru and Mahmuda factions were arrested. They had orchestrated attacks dating back to the uranium facility raid in 2013 and the infamous Kuje prison break in 2022. It was a win, a big one. But something was strange. These men hadn't been hiding in the Sahel's desolate north. They were in cities, among civilians. Not hunted in caves, but mingling in markets. It sent a message louder than any bomb. The war wasn't out there. It was in here. The Nigerian government, in response, made its move. It requested help, and Washington delivered. Not with reforms, not with community outreach, but with a familiar package. Missiles, bombs, targeting systems. Once again, the solution was steel. And once again, the media applauded. CNN called it a renewed commitment to Nigerian security. The Pentagon praised our trusted African partner. No one asked the obvious. Why are we fighting the same war, with the same tools, expecting a different result? Let's be clear. Nigeria does face a very real threat. Boko Haram may not dominate headlines anymore, but their tactics have evolved. They've splintered into factions, ISWAP being the most brutal. They use drones, homemade explosives, child soldiers. They infiltrate rural regions, undermine governance, and leverage social media better than most ministries. In many ways, they are no longer just insurgents, they are system disruptors. What they wage is not a war of territory, it's a war of perception. They win when the state looks weak, when fear replaces trust, when citizens begin to think, maybe they're the only ones who can provide order. That's not a battlefield you conquer with warplanes. But here's the deeper question. Why does the United States continue to invest in Nigeria's military hardware while neglecting the root? Some say it's about oil. Others point to strategic positioning. Nigeria borders the Atlantic, the Sahel, and Central Africa. And some, quietly, whisper a darker truth. A destabilized West Africa gives Washington more reasons to stay. Let's zoom out. In the last 10 years, American arms sales to Africa have quietly expanded. Not just Nigeria, Kenya, Egypt, Tunisia, even the Central African Republic. But in most cases, there's a pattern. The more weapons arrive, the less the region stabilizes. Not because the weapons cause instability, but because they are rarely accompanied by accountability. Who trains the trainers? Who monitors end use? And more importantly, who profits? In 2022, Lockheed Martin made over $60 billion in defense revenue. Raytheon, $68 billion. Their African contracts are a tiny slice of that pie, but they serve another purpose: narrative, control, presence. Because where there are American weapons, there must be American advisors. And where there are advisors, policy follows. Not African policy, Washington's policy. So what happens when Nigeria becomes increasingly dependent on these systems? What happens when maintenance requires U.S. contractors? What happens when targeting software needs remote authorization? What happens when a nation's defense becomes a subscription service? This is not an argument against defending Nigeria. No one should tolerate Boko Haram. But we must ask, with urgency, if the tools being offered are tools of empowerment or tools of surveillance. If they're solutions or symbols. Because peace cannot be downloaded, sovereignty cannot be programmed. And when history looks back at 2025, it won't ask how many missiles were delivered. It will ask who was really in command. What do you think? Is America truly helping Nigeria defeat terror, or simply buying influence with a different name? Comment below. And remember, not every gift comes without a price. The weapons arrived, the press celebrated. Nigeria stood taller, at least on the surface. But beneath the surface, another equation was taking shape. Because in the modern era of warfare, missiles are not just metal, they are algorithms. Firepower no longer travels with flags, it travels with firmware. And the question is not just who holds the weapons, it is who controls their code. When Nigeria accepted the $346 million package, it did not only acquire Hellfire missiles and precision bombs, it accepted systems that depend on American software, American technicians, American authorizations. Some of these weapons require remote calibration. Some need periodic re-authentication from servers not hosted in Abuja, but in Virginia, Maryland, or Nevada. What Nigeria now has, many call strength, But in the age of interconnected war, it may be something else. Dependency. And dependency wears the mask of partnership. Back in 2022, when Nigeria received Super Tucano aircraft under U.S. military sales, a clause was quietly inserted. The aircraft would be supported by U.S. contractors for 10 years. Maintenance, system updates, flight data. That contract wasn't just about spare parts, it was about access. Who gets to see the missions flown? Who owns the logs? Who updates the targeting algorithms? Who decides what Nigeria sees and what it does not? What happens when a missile fails to fire? Not because it is broken, but because a line of code said no. This is not fiction, this is how modern warfare works. Africa is not new to this.
Libya once had one of the largest arms arsenals on the continent. Then came a war, a no-fly zone, and a blackout of command systems. The weapons became scrap metal overnight. Somalia, Ethiopia, even South Africa all faced the ghost of this new warfare, hardware without sovereignty. Now Nigeria stands at the edge of the same cliff, and here lies the paradox. In the name of fighting insurgents who hijack the future of Nigerian youth, the state has imported a digital leash, one it may never be able to remove. But the people are not told this. They are shown ceremonies, weapon unveilings, military parades, flags, chants, patriotic songs, the illusion of power, the spectacle of security. And yet, when night falls, the war still creeps back through the savannah, in places where bombs cannot reach, in mines no missile can scan. The insurgency is not afraid of steel. It feeds on silence, on disillusion, on the broken contract between the people and those who govern them. And American weapons, no matter how precise, cannot rebuild that trust. Because real security does not start with a Hellfire missile, it starts with food, with jobs, with dignity. It starts in schools, not supply chains, in dialogue, not drone footage. So we must ask again, what does Washington really want? Is this about stability or leverage? Is this about partnership or pre-positioning? Is this about protecting Nigeria or preparing it for something else? In geopolitics, answers rarely come with honesty, but clues are everywhere. In 2023, a U.S. intelligence memo, leaked but never confirmed, hinted at contingency planning for African regional instability. It named Nigeria, Mali, Ethiopia, even Ghana. The memo spoke of non-permissive environments and the necessity of forward operating logistic support. It was military speak, but it meant one thing: prepare the ground, be ready to step in. And when you want to step in somewhere, you need friends who owe you favors. Weapons are excellent down payments. And so, Nigeria was paid in missiles. But who really bought who? Across Africa, leaders are watching, some with hope, some with hesitation, some with silence. Because every weapon that lands on Nigerian soil sends a message, not just to insurgents, but to other governments. This is how Washington rewards compliance. It raises a frightening possibility that sovereignty itself is being priced. And those who refuse to sell it, they're called rebels, pariahs, radicals, unstable. Even when they stand on their own feet, even when they say no, even when they ask the very same questions we ask here. Pause for a moment. Ask yourself, what does it mean to be secure? Is it the sound of a jet roaring above your city, or the sound of your child laughing without fear? Is it the arrival of weapons, or the return of water, of teachers, of healing? This is not about blaming America. It is about unmasking the script, because the script is old, and Africa is tired. If you feel this, even a little, speak it. Say something in the comments. Let your voice be one more thread in the tapestry of those who see and will no longer be silent, Because Africa's future cannot be outsourced, and silence is no longer an option. Power is seductive, and in moments of fear, it becomes even more so. For Nigeria, the choice seemed obvious. Take the weapons, fight the insurgents, secure the nation, show strength. But strength, when borrowed, becomes illusion. And across the continent, other nations are watching, not with envy, but with calculation. Senegal, tethered to military cooperation with France, now faces growing internal dissent. Kenya, long hailed as a strategic partner of the West, quietly questions the price of visibility. Ghana, once a beacon of stability, is seeing shadows emerge at the edges of its sovereignty. Because the African people are waking up. They no longer want to be told what security means. They want to define it on their own terms. And that definition does not always include airstrikes. It includes land to farm, clean water, a school that stays open during the rains, a government that listens before it shoots. It includes dignity. And as the weapons land in Lagos, a silence settles over the rest of the map. Not every nation is clapping. Not every president is praising. Some are taking notes. Others are quietly drawing lines. Because the era of silent compliance is dying, and something else is being born in its place. But it is not born without conflict. In Niger, a government once dependent on French military support chose to cut ties. The West called it dangerous, but others called it courageous. In Mali, leaders declared that sovereignty meant saying no, not just to threats, but to those who claimed to be protectors. In Burkina Faso, President Ibrahim Traoré turned down multiple military aid offers, not because he didn't need help, but because he knew the price of invisible strings. And while some laughed, others listened. Because every time a nation rejects an offer that comes with surveillance, strings, or subservience, it creates a new vocabulary for Africa. One that says, we remember. We remember what foreign partnership looked like. We remember who benefited. We remember what we lost. And we are choosing differently now. In 2025, the real war in Africa is not between states and insurgents. It is between models. One model says, you cannot survive without us. The other whispers, try. One model offers loans, drones, and advisors. The other builds with mud, sweat, and dignity. One says, trust us, we've done this before. The other says, yes, and that is exactly why we won't let you do it again. This is the crossroads. Nigeria took a path, not the only one, but the most familiar. It is not too late to step back, but the deeper the weapons dig into the soil, the harder the roots grow around them, and uprooting what is buried in concrete is never clean. Let us not judge too quickly. Nigeria is not the villain, nor is it a victim. It is a nation caught between the fire of internal collapse and the embrace of external control. And like many African nations, it must make its way through this storm, often alone, often misunderstood, often mocked. But let us be clear, not every weapon given is a gesture of solidarity. Sometimes it is a marker, a stake, a flag. And when the day comes that those weapons are turned against the will of the people, the paper trail will vanish. The contracts will be denied. The fingerprints washed away. And Nigeria will be told, you chose this. But we see and we will not forget, because Africa deserves better than being someone else's training ground. Africa deserves leaders who can say no. Africa deserves children who do not mistake war for normal. Africa deserves sovereignty, not as a slogan, but as a lived, daily reality. And every time a country takes a step in that direction, it becomes a lighthouse. Not a perfect one, but a light nonetheless. And in a continent long kept in the dark, even a flicker becomes a signal. This is not a fight between East and West. It is a fight between ownership and obedience, between nations who sign their future in ink and those who sign in code they cannot read. And in this war, not every gunshot is heard. Some are silent. They come in the form of signed deals, encrypted software, and locked supply chains. But the wounds bleed just the same. If you are still with us, if you have felt this truth ring in your chest, then do not just scroll away. Say something. Say anything. In the comments, in your circle, in your heart. Because what is happening now is not about weapons. It is about memory and choice. And it is about the possibility, still alive, that Africa can choose differently. If you believe that sovereignty is not something to be granted, but to be reclaimed, then stand with those who dare to reclaim it. Drop a comment. Share this story. Let it echo where silence has long ruled. And as above all, subscribe. Because stories like this are not just updates, they are resistance. And every view is a vote.
We thought it was about weapons. We thought it was about security. But what if the real power does not lie in the missiles, but in the manuals, in the contracts, in the operating systems embedded inside every machine shipped to Africa, written in code, updated from abroad, unreadable to those who fire them? Because in the 21st century, war is not just physical. It is systemic. It is legal. It is digital. And Nigeria, like many before it, may not have bought firepower. It may have bought dependence. Behind every weapons sale lies a network. Lawyers, lobbyists, tech consultants, retired generals turned corporate executives. They do not wear uniforms. They wear tailored suits. They do not invade, they invoice. And they do not need to raise a flag to own the battlefield. They only need access, data, entrances into systems, exclusive maintenance contracts, fine print that says, "You cannot repair this without us," terms that say, "You must notify us before use." Control is no longer enforced by soldiers on the ground. It is embedded in software updates and encrypted protocols. This is the war Nigeria may have unknowingly signed on to. Think of it. What happens when a sovereign nation must email Washington before launching a strike? What happens when field reports must be uploaded to platforms stored in U.S. military cloud networks? What happens when sensitive data, troop positions, flight paths, communication logs are mirrored in real time, somewhere else? This is not science fiction. It is already happening. Because the tools that now protect Nigeria may already be transmitting more than defense. They may be exporting its autonomy. And while the world debates democracy versus dictatorship, another empire rises. Not with tanks, but with terms of service. And Africa is the testing ground. Because it is easier to install systems where oversight is weak. It is easier to dominate with spreadsheets than with soldiers. And the battlefield becomes quiet, not because the war is won, but because the voice of the nation is no longer heard. Only the pings of systems waiting for authorization. There was a time when colonialism wore a flag. Now it wears a login. And sovereignty is measured not in speeches, but in root access. So here is the twist. Perhaps the $346 million sent to Nigeria was not meant to end the war. Perhaps it was meant to move the command center out of Abuja into Arlington, out of Africa into algorithms. And if this is true, if the future of African security is now written in foreign code, then we must ask with clarity, who really owns the trigger? And who owns the silence that follows? In the end, this is not about Nigeria alone. It is about every nation that has been told,
You are strong only when we arm you. It is about a continent that has been offered contracts instead of dignity, weapons instead of wisdom, and silence instead of sovereignty. But Africa is not a code to be programmed. It is not a base to be leased. It is not a battlefield to be managed by remote. It is a voice, a will, a future that belongs to its people. So let this be a reckoning, not just of weapons, but of choices. Because the day is coming when Africa must decide not who gives the best deals, but who lets it walk freely. And if that day begins with questions, let those questions start here. And somewhere in the Sahel, where no missile arrives without scrutiny, a new model rises, led not by gifts, but by grit. They call it AES. If this story moved you, let it move others. Like, comment, share, subscribe. Because freedom begins with truth, and truth is no longer waiting.